The metal strap cut into Mara Ortega's palm as she dragged the crate through the hangar, and the thing inside, small, luminous, breathing in a voice that was not a voice, reached a tendril of light out toward her like a beggar asking for the last coin. She should have left it. She should have closed the crate, sealed it with agency tape, and walked out with the evidence of her failure like a tooth pulled clean. Instead, she whispered, "Shh," and pressed her forehead to the cool grain of the lid, because it felt, with everything crowded under her ribs, like the only honest thing left to do. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds, if this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. The hangar smelled of oil, ozone, and the kind of institutional bleach that promises sterility and keeps secrets alive. Beyond its corrugated doors, the Nevada night was an empty sheet of stars, too many to be comforting. They felt like distant witnesses. Lights strobed in the compound, red for lockdown, blue for diagnostics, a thin, clinical green that washed over the crate as if to judge it. Someone had left a cup of coffee on a folding table and a half-mapped flight plan on a clipboard. Someone had decided that late-night coffee stains and bureaucratic sloppiness were acceptable collateral damage against the possibility of an interstellar scandal. Someone had also left the crate unlocked, which was why Mara could be carrying it now instead of a team of men in regulation jackets. She had come to Nevada because her brother had gone into a hangar and never come out. Because the day they told her it was a weather balloon, she felt the world tilt on an axis that made everything dishonest. Because 10 years cataloging debris and interviewing eyewitnesses taught her one thing. People lie, institutions lie, but wounds do not heal unless someone pulls the jagged things from them. She was 32, the practical one in every room, the one who became competent by stacking distrust into an art form. Grief had made her practical and reckless at once. The two qualities were wearing the same face. The thing in the crate, if it could be called a thing, had skin that drank the light around it and ran faint luminescent veins like reefs of electricity. When she nosed the lid open an inch, it lifted its head and poured an image into her mind. A fragile glass dome in a garden of cold stars, and under the dome a table where many hands, many kinds of hands, were folded in sorrow. The image came with a scent she could feel in her chest, iron and rain and salt water from a shore she had never known. She staggered back. Mercy, she thought, don't fall in love. Save it and leave. "You're going to get yourself killed," said a voice from the dark. The voice she used to argue with over cheap coffee and grant proposals. Daniel Crane stepped from the shadow of an empty maintenance bay, suit uncreased, hair still dark with the last rain, and his eyes were the same sharp blue that had once catalogued her like a careful, resentful archivist. He had been a love and a ledger both. They had been two people that didn't speak about the same future. Now he wore a badge and a mandate, and the badge made him larger than a man who loved her once. "You didn't come to give me ethical lectures, Crane," Mara said. Her voice shaved the air. The crate hummed, a small animal breath under thin wood. Daniel's jaw tightened. A dozen men were listening beyond the doors, teams in tactical vests, radios murmuring like cicadas. But for a single thin second, it was only the three of them, Mara, the crate, and the man who had once taught her how to keep secrets that bit back. "You know what happens if word gets out," he said. "Containment, masks, med specialists, a tribunal. You know where it leads." "I know where it led my brother." The name burned in her mouth like something she should not say aloud. His death had been folded into a file, a socketed casualty number in some classified ledger. She wanted the files torn open, the light to be harsh and public and painful and honest. Daniel had promised a safe, quiet investigation. He had taken the oath, sworn to the agency before he ever swore to her. The promises pulled like opposite tides. The crate clicked, deliberate, small, and the light inside flared. The being raised a limb and traced a warm, shimmering path across the rough wood with a fingertip. It tipped its head, an expression of feral intelligence, and then did something Mara had not expected. It offered her its hand. Not a hand like human hands, not at all, but a braided fringe of filaments that twined when she looked away. Her palm shook as she reached. The filaments wound around her fingers with a tenderness that made her breathe out. It understood her, she realized. Understood the syllables of her anger and her sorrow in a way her colleagues had never been trained to notice. It poured a small tidal image into her skull, a child running through a field of mirrors that reflected not faces, but possibilities. The being's impression was a question. Do you want to see? Mara closed her eyes to the foyer of memories it offered. She saw flashes of the last 10 years, catalogs of metal debris, interviews at the edges of towns, the way her brother's laughter lived in the hinge of her elbow. And she saw the thing's otherness until it was unbearable. And then, beneath that otherness, something like a map, light radiating under the desert, veins of luminescence buried 200 feet beneath the sand, a network of tunnels and chambers beneath Nevada that pulsed like a city sleeping between beats. In that flash, the being did not just show her geometry. It revealed a truth she had suspected and resisted. People buried things down here to keep from dealing with them. It's a diplomat, she heard herself say, because what else could you call an exile who carried images like letters? The being pulsed softer, as if pleased. Eiler. It placed the sound into her mind, not in words, but as a warm, foreign taste. She answered with the name she had brought like a bandage, Mara. The exchange was a bargain struck without paper. Daniel's silhouette was unbending. You can't. I can, Mara said. Her hands had decided before the rest of her had consented. She wrapped the crate in a tarp that smelt faintly of engine grease and the jasmine sweetness of the coffee someone had abandoned. They moved like ghosts toward the maintenance exit. The night swallowed human shapes better than the day. It gave cover to things that did not belong. They had crafted a plan that had the brittle elegance of a confession. Mara would wheel the crate to a shuttered hangar near the edge of the base, where a Cessna's tail cone waited like a small, ordinary altar. Daniel would pretend to be late on patrol and delay anyone who asked questions with his usual procedural calm. Mara would drive. Mara would fly. They had 3 hours and 2 divides, the moral one inside her chest and the legal one written in black on state paper. The desert was dry and honest beneath the wheels of her borrowed Dodge. The taillights drew blood-red commas on the road, as if the world itself was taking notes. Eiler, she liked the sound of naming him to the dark, spoke to her sparingly during the drive. It was best, she decided, to let him reveal himself slowly. Early revelations had a way of changing the face of the danger. His presence hummed like a cello behind her ribs. When she brushed a bandage over his luminescent arm, he tingled as if it were music. Images fluttered across her mind with glass windows that showed not landscapes, but the slow drift of nebula. Hands of many widths and colors clasping and unloosening. A ring of exiled diplomats, their sentences like birds. It was all so vast, she wanted to collapse into comprehension and also run until the asphalt peeled off into nothing. At the small airstrip, they kept the Cessna running in the dark because engines were easier to explain than the truth. Daniel counted the minutes, his jaw working, a man performing grief as if it were a ritual to keep from breaking. He did not understand that for Mara, grief could make her brave and reckless in the same heartbeat. She thought of her brother's smile and the way he'd threaded his fingers through hers at a funeral once, making a private promise to stay foolishly present in a world that pretended not to need him. The crate was lifted into the plane by hands that trembled. Eiler hummed acoustically at the sudden motion. His pulse ran like desert lightning against the plywood. Inside the cabin, voyaging felt absurd and holy. The instrument lights cut the interior into pale slices. The horizon was a lesser black beyond the window. The plane took off with a wobble that felt like an apology to physics. Mara's fingers sank into the fabric of her seat. She had flown in worse storms, but nothing with the kind of intimate danger that makes the air around you feel personal. Before takeoff, he reached for the tarp and, with a motion so gentle it made her throat ache, traced her knuckles with those filaments. The contact sent another image. Two figures on an unknown shore watching a vessel leave. The vessel's wake was stars, and the two figures were not connected. The image said what he could not in language. I have left things behind, too. Daniel leaned across the console, his breath a net that tried to capture her in the moment. If this goes wrong, if anyone finds him, I'm not asking you to save him, Mara. It's orders. And if this goes right, she said, because her hands had stopped being idle. She let the question hang between them like a desperate bird. If it goes right, then maybe we can tell the children below that someone cares enough to look. He flinched at the word children. The sight of him taking a human pain aside made the edges of her resolve sharper. She thought of what might be living under the desert, hybrids with her brother's eyes maybe, or with no knowledge that their parents made bargains over their heads, and the thought was a small, burning thing inside her. The plane climbed into a roof of black. Radio chatter thinned until it was a thin linen thread of sound. Ilyar put his head against the crate's wall and let an image spill into her like a touch. A cavern with stalactites like the teeth of ancient gods, and within it a ring of small bodies sleeping under a glassy dome. The scene was at once exquisite and monstrous. It tasted of milk and metal. Mara pressed her palms into her thighs, trying to absorb the betrayal of his reality and her own complicity in systems that traded life for stability. She remembered the day they told her the balloon had been nothing. She had laughed then, a brittle noise that didn't know how to make sound match the bones of grief. That laugh had been a closing. Tonight, she was opening things again, in a way that might save a life, or ignite everything in a way that could not be undone. There was a soft clack from the rear, the sound of something aligning. Mara met Daniel's eyes across the console. For a suspended heartbeat, they were two people balanced on a moral knife edge. Then the plane lurched toward the dark, and with it, the fragile, dangerous truce between them rolled forward into the night. The plane shuddered as if remembering every storm it had ever flown through. Mara felt each tremor as a question. Outside the tiny windows, the desert was a black ocean. Flats and ridges folded into one another like a secret kept between two lovers. Under that blanket lay the thing Ilyar had shown her. Lattices and corridors, children breathing in glass domes, a bureaucracy of silence. The thought of those sleeping figures, small, pale, hybrid, made her throat close until she tasted iron. She had not come here to be a savior. She had come to be honest. But mercy did not always arrive with clean hands. Ilyar was quiet in a way that was not simple silence, but a presence that occupied the cabin with the density of a storm cloud. When he pressed his head to the crate, he sent smaller images, touches, a laugh like the clink of crystal, a counsel where hands that were not hands argued like humans. Sometimes the scenes folded into one another until Mara could not tell whether she was seeing refractions of his memory or her own hope mirrored back. Once, between images, he touched the inside of the crate with a filament and translated pain into a wave she could anchor to. She learned to listen by feeling. She learned Ilyr's language in the way it rearranged her bladder of fear into something like resolve. Daniel watched her without saying anything. He had not slept, and the angle of his jaw showed it. His lips were a thin line that did not betray whether he would obey orders or love. He had been trained to put containment above compassion, to let the good of many insist on the suffering of a few. Mara had always argued that the few were the ones who remembered how to be human. Now, with Ilyr's light sculpting new bones under her skin, she feared she had become that very thing she had lectured against, sentimental, ruinous with feeling. They flew toward a mile marker on a map they'd drawn on the napkin of necessity, an abandoned research outpost whose security had been mothballed during budget cuts and never properly reactivated. It was an unremarkable rectangle of concrete the government no longer bothered to remember. For Mara, it was a kind of promise. Obscurity could be a refuge if one chose the right kind of ruins to hide in. She pictured the nights beneath the dome he had shown her, the children, the lights like slow stars, a city that existed in secret to protect and to imprison. Protect and imprison, two halves of the same hand. The Cessna's engine whined in a monotone that made Mara's teeth feel thin. Outside, small hairs on her arms raised and fell with the pressurization clicks. Once they were airborne, the world felt less like solid ground and more like an idea, and in an idea you could imagine tearing a seam. Ilyr's filament touched her wrist, delicate as an apology. An image flickered, two figures standing at opposite ends of a table, each holding one end of a rope. Behind one was a hall of stars, behind the other a room with yellow walls and children's drawings. The image asked her to choose for a second the scale of her priorities. Was she committed to the furious, impossible honesty of ripping everything into the open? Or could she live with a secret that kept some lives safe? She did not have an answer. She had her brother's empty chair and a series of official reports that smelled like disinfectant and denial. She had a badge of a different color, one not printed in law but sewn into the fabric of her own heart. That badge read, "Do not let another child sleep alone if you can help it." Where would they go? Daniel asked finally, his voice a plains contra, low, resistant. He had not wanted to voice it because to name the children was to make fragile citizens out of abstractions. If we expose them, who guarantees they'll be taken care of? Who guarantees they won't become bargaining chips? Mara thought of political headlines and diplomatic blackboards, of committees with too many hands and not enough conscience. She thought of a brassy woman in a congressional hearing on cable news, bending facts to fit a narrative, her voice like a claw. She thought, impossibly, of her brother lying on his side, hand tucked under his cheek, nothing but the sound of the ventilator and the bolt of institutional refusal to be human. "We guarantee them care," she said. "We keep them somewhere safe until we can figure out a plan. We find families. We—" She stopped because the sentence wanted to be a prophecy, and she was not a prophet. Ilyar pulsed softly at her words. He did not understand human bureaucracy, perhaps, but he understood children, and the feeling he sent warmed her like a blanket. A memory surfaced in flashes, a small creature, maybe not human, twining filaments with Ilyar's hand. Someone whispering a lullaby in a language that also smelled like rust. There was an intimacy to his recollections that made their ethical dilemma sting in a different place, not in abstract policy, but in the small, flat heart of caregiving. Whatever line they crossed would touch lives directly. "Mara," Daniel said, the name a barbed tool. "This isn't just about children. It's about treaties, about our national security. There are decisions made at levels above us that calculate risks with other scales. You know what a diplomatic rupture with unknown civilizations could cost." She knew. She imagined fleets not unlike the craft Ilyar had described. Glass domes, hands, and music like subsonic speech. She imagined entire political philosophies that would rather bury a secret than engage with it. But when those calculations were made, faces were reduced to footnotes. Those calculations are not people, she said. They do not feel the same way. He searched her face as if looking for the loss of a ledger's columns, for numbers she had misplaced. The vulnerability that made her dangerous, her insistence on individual worth, made him ache in ways that had nothing to do with policy. He had once called her a moral hazard and then kissed her like a thief. Now, under the small lamps of instrument panels and Ilyar's calm radiance, he was human again, broken, exact, and possessed by a duty she had never envied and sometimes had admired. Below the plain, the desert shifted. For a moment, the moon, thin and pale, slipped from the cloud bank like a coin, and the world brightened to reveal, in the distance, the faint grid of the agency's lights. They were less a city and more a constellation of surveillance, watches placed like teeth along the jawline of the earth. Mara swallowed. She had stolen the crate, but she had not stolen the truth from the people who kept their mouths shut to protect it. A warning ping sounded on Daniel's console, high and precise. He frowned, pivoting. Someone pinged a perimeter sensor 20 miles southwest, he said. Could be wildlife, could be a drone, could be the agency getting suspicious. Mara felt her heart ratchet into another gear. The plan had always been brittle, contingency-ridden, like a confession made under pressure. She looked at Ilyar, who, in that split second, sent a single image so sharp it felt like a blade. A corridor lit from below, boots coming down in a line, a shadow of a man looking like Daniel, only more certain. Ilyar's image was a notice. Time was not an ally. We can outrun them, Mara decided. The words came like a rope thrown to herself. We can bring him to the outpost, and from there what? She had rehearsed speeches, legal defenses, compassionate appeals. She had not rehearsed the sound of boots thundering up a concrete ramp with the authority of law. Daniel's hand tightened on the yoke. His jaw moved. The muscles there were a language of their own. We can't outrun a coordinated response, he said. They'll have UAVs, they'll have sensor arrays. If they mark this craft. If they mark it, they find a plane flying at 2,000 feet in the middle of nowhere with a crate in the back, Mara said. If they find it, they find me. They find you. They find whatever's under these feet. Her voice had the tremor of someone balancing on the lip of a cliff. Ilyar's filaments curled and then uncurled. He sent a quiet gift, a memory of a star reef so dense with shipping lanes that passing through it took the skill of a helmsman and the courage of a thief. The impression had the quality of a promise and a warning folded together. It meant, we can help you. It meant also, if you do this, you are leaving the map of your life behind. Mara thought of the maps she had kept over the years, filing them in boxes with letters written in her brother's hand. She had always believed maps could lead you back to something true. This map promised no return. It offered instead a forward into dangerous mercy. The idea made her stomach hollow and full at once. There's another way, Daniel said suddenly. A conference we could call internal council, classified. We present evidence, we vote to disclose or to shelter. It takes time, but it gives us legal cover. She looked at him as if he had offered up a different planet. Time is what they use to bury things, she said. If we go to council, they will file it. They will put it in a drawer with items marked sensitive. The children won't be in drawers. He exhaled, long and tired. Then you choose recklessness over procedure, he said. There was accusation there, but also, beneath it, the fragile shape of something like hope. You choose the risk. I choose the children, she said. For a second, the plane held its breath. Then the ping returned, another, more insistent this time. The sound was like a scab being picked clean. Daniel slammed the radio frequency and spoke. Crane to base, we have an anomaly on the southwest grid. Repeat, anomaly. Requesting status. Silence answered him at first, thin and brittle. Then a voice, professional and metallic, said words that sounded like lengths of chain. Unidentified signature, describing flight path, small aircraft, non-compliant, vectoring response. Mara felt something like ice spread under her ribs. The decision she had already made now had consequences with names and numbers. She touched Ilyar's crate as if to anchor herself to the thing that made voices say his name. The filaments brushed her hand back, a soft squeeze, an old friend's promise not to let go. Outside, lights bloomed on the desert as units shifted like constellations rearranging themselves. In the cabin, the three of them became a triangle of impossible loyalties. Mara, who had chosen feeling over law. Daniel, who stood balanced on duty and the memory of love. And Ilyar, whose presence made both men and policies into vulnerable things. The plane rocked and dipped as if the sky itself were reconsidering their right to passage. Mara slid her hands into her pockets and found the small silver band she kept for luck, the one her brother had given her when she left for the first graveyard of conspiracies. She had thought it would remind her of the rules. Now it only reminded her that the rules had been written by people who feared what they could not control. She looked at Daniel and felt, in the oldest part of her chest, the ache and the possibility of reconciliation. He was not her enemy. He was instead a man made by forces she resented but understood. Love and duty had always been their private orbit. Now that orbit had become a collision course. "We make for the outpost," she said. "We land at dusk if we can. We handle whatever comes next, together." Daniel's eyes flicked to her hand and then back to his instruments. He seemed to weigh the world on a scale that only he could read. Finally, he nodded once, the decision almost a prayer. "Together," he echoed. Ilyar sent an image then that Mara could only describe later as a sigh, a small figure running across a room toward a window, a hand reaching for another hand that did not belong to a single species. It was a depiction of trust given in the most dangerous currency. In the hum of the Cessna, in the grid of lights below, inside the crate that warmed under her hands, their triangle tightened into a fragile pact. The desert beneath them held its breath. The agency's lights blinked like the eyes of an animal. The night was not yet over, and neither were the choices that would change everything. The ping multiplied into a pattern, like a nervous heartbeat. Lights on the horizon rearranged into chevrons of suspicion. The desert under them was a map of pursuit now, not refuge. Mara felt each new ping as a small cosmic judgment, and with every sound, the fragile architecture of their plan trembled. Daniel's fingers went white on the controls. He spoke tersely into the headset, and then cut the transmission. His jaw worked like a man trying to hold back the tide with his teeth. "We can't stay on this vector," he said. "They're triangulating us." Mara's stomach folded into a question mark. The outpost they'd chosen was still hours away, a rectangle of ruin promising anonymity. "Change course," she said, the words brittle but steady. "We can lay low, then go in at dawn." "No," Daniel countered. "That's exactly the kind of window they'll use to close the trap. If we run, they chase. If we land, we get containment but a chance to plead." "A chance to file the kids away," Mara snapped. Her voice surprised her by how small it sounded at the end. "We agreed, Crane. We promised to do more than narrate their erasure." A hard animal sound lived behind his eyes. "You promised a thing you don't understand the cost of," he said. "You promised rebellion." "I promised to not let my brother be a martyr to secrecy," Mara said. She closed her eyes and smelled the engines and the faint rust of Ilyar's luminescent skin. The being inside the crate sent pictures that moved like wet leaves, hallways, nurses with faces like maps, children sleeping under domes. He did not yet know human law. He only knew the small mercies and betrayals of caregiving. That was danger enough. The Cessna dipped, a gentle but meaningful shift, less a fault of flight and more the shape of a decision. Daniel banked east, away from the grid of agency lights, into a stretch of desert that was blank on every map they had. Mara felt the plane cut the air as if it were re-choosing a life form. Ilyar's filaments stroked her wrist once and then rapped lightly, a promise and a plea. "We can try an unlisted approach," Daniel said after a long beat. "There are maintenance strips not on active routing. We land there, refuel from a drum I've cached, and then we slip to the outpost under the cover of terrain." "You have caches?" Mara asked, incredulous and not ungrateful. Every revelation from him now felt like an old love affair, secret compartments, hidden hands. That he had thought of contingency made her both safer and more exposed. "I prepared for contingencies when I thought we were writing the future together," he said quietly. "I never thought you'd actually use them against the ledger." Mara's laugh had no joy in it. "Against the ledger? I'm trying to save people." Daniel's look softened and then hardened into something that was as much pity as pain. "So are we," he said, "in our way." They flew low when they could, the Cessna digging into valleys and rising on thermal sails. Dust rose and fell in slow languages below them. The plane's shadow brushed dry washes like a hand across skin. With each mile, their path diverged from the script the agency would have preferred, the neat dramaturgy of containment, and into something ragged and true. The air was cooler near the ground, and the sound of their flight flattened into a single, intimate note. When they landed in the wash of bleached rocks, the desert seemed quieter than a withheld secret. Daniel moved with a competence that had once been intimate, and in the small economy of their actions, covering the crate, masking heat signatures, siphoning fuel from a metal drum hidden beneath tumbleweed, old muscles remembered rituals that had once been shared. There was a closeness to it, a domesticity born of mutual history. The same hands that had once adjusted her collar now held a can of fuel at an angle to fill a battered canister. Mara's heart kept trying to translate duty into tenderness. "You'll need to trust me," Daniel said when they were crouched in the stubby shadow of an outcropping, the plane a hunched animal behind them. He had never asked her for trust. The words felt heavy and raw, like a confession that might end with pleading. "If we make it to the outpost, I can get us temporary diplomatic cover, I can slow them down, but I cannot promise your freedom forever." "And I cannot promise not to tell," Mara said. "I can't keep a secret that would let children sleep in domes and call it mercy." Silence collapsed a fraction as the desert settled around them. Ilyar pressed his head against the wood of the crate and sent an image that was not a city, but a single bed with a small curled figure under a blanket. The simplicity of it, the intimacy of a bed, unstrung Mara in a way that abstract politics never could. How do you argue bureaucracy into a child's sleep? They moved like conspirators and lovers both, clandestine in their method, intimate in their proximity. When they lifted the crate into a service vehicle for the final leg, shoulders brushed and fingers lingered as if for reassurance. The physical nearness sang in Mara's chest. She realized she wanted Daniel to look at her without the ledger between them, to make a choice that was human and not procedural. He met her gaze once and then looked away, his profile struck by moonlight, lined like a map. At the outpost, the air smelled of ancient coffee and dust. A generator coughed like an old man telling jokes. The building's interior was a relic of federal budgets past, folding chairs with vinyl cracked at the seams, fluorescent lights that hummed like insects. It was anonymous enough that secrets could breathe there without the suffocating formality of a base hangar. Daniel used a key code pulled from a memory only he seemed to hold, and the doors opened without protest. Once inside, they collapsed into the imperfect shelter like trespassers who had arrived home. Mara dragged the crate to a back room, a place where old paperwork had been boxed and the air tasted of mildew. There, amid cardboard and forgotten memos, Ilyar was gently eased out of the crate. He unfolded himself like a small tide, filaments unwinding and then finding her fingers as if drawn by gravity. Up close, his skin was more than light. It was the illusion of it made corporeal. Veins like pale sapphires traced his limbs. He regarded them both with intelligence that felt like a kind of grief. When he touched Mara's hand again, the images he poured were raw, less ceremonial. A child's first steps, a lullaby hummed under a star sky, the smell of wet clay. He had no words for petition. He had only pictures and the mutual language of need. "Show me again," Mara whispered to him. She needed the proof to fortify her moral spine. He obliged, and the room filled with the sensation of caves lit from within, corridors with glass domes, children playing with toys that were both organic and engineered. They seemed so fragile in the visions, pale hair, eyes that held catalogs of other people's dreams. Mara's throat constricted. She had not come to Nevada to be anything but honest, but honesty had teeth that could bite the most tender places. Daniel stood at the doorway, arms crossed, the silhouette of a man watching something he could not yet legislatively endorse. He was a statue of restraint until the visions finished, and the last image, of a child's face pressing against the glass as if searching for a mother, remained in the air between them. "You're willing to risk war for a few children," he said slowly, not accusing so much as listing a fact. The words were an inventory. Mara's reply was immediate, a thing of bone and impulse. "They're not a few," she said. "They're people. They are the reason we are supposed to be better." Daniel exhaled like a man conceding terrain. "We don't get to decide what better costs us," he said, "not alone." "You mean you don't want to decide," she countered, the anger in her voice more youthful than she felt. The room was too small for all the histories they were carrying. Her grief, his duty, Ilyar's exile, all of it pressed elbows into the air. Ilyar's filaments tightened as if he too felt the pressure of their argument. He unfolded a new image, a council room under a sky that was not theirs, where figures like himself argued about sentient boundaries. There were other species there, each with different standards and different appetites for secrecy. One voice in that vision, sharp and like winter glass, pointed to Earth and pronounced it unready. The verdict had been exile for him, a diplomatic banishment that tasted like salt. He had been given refuge on the margins, not choice. "Your government's made a bargain," Daniel said to Ilyar, finally turning his authority not against Mara but toward the alien. "You gave us some technology. We gave you territory over our fear. How do you expect us to untangle that now without causing collapse?" Ilyar's image was a counterweight, a memory of a child teaching him how to make a toy from wire, the child's laugh a sound like small bells. The impression answered without speech. "We didn't mean to bargain away lives. We meant to learn. We meant to belong." Mara felt the argument like a weather front. She was an axis in it, all latitudes and no longitudes. Her brother's absence had taught her to distrust institutions, but she also knew the scaffolding of government had a terrifying capacity to do harm. If she tore open the agreement between worlds, who would stitch the rent? If she sealed it, who would cradle the sleeping children? "There's another problem," Daniel said suddenly, the engineer of containment reasserting himself. "Even if we save them, even if we smuggle them out, who will protect them from being weaponized? A secret revealed becomes a lever. The wrong hands will see profit or power." Mara's heart was a stone in her throat. "Then we protect them," she said fiercely. "We build a case so compelling that the world can't look away. We find allies. We bring journalists who actually care." Daniel's expression softened with an old tenderness. "You still think you can change the world with arguments?" "I think someone has to try," she said. They argued until the room cooled and the moon shifted. Words were inadequate tools for mending the racking presence of guilt and love between them. At times, they circled each other like predators learning a new prey. Each kernel of a plan tested, each vulnerability poked. The fractures were becoming visible. Trust that had once been implicit now required paperwork. Loyalty had to be renegotiated in legalese. Between Mara and Daniel, their love was not so much broken as reformed into something stranger, an alloy of desire and ethical calculation. At last, Eiley reached into the pocket of the tarp and produced a tiny device that looked like a smooth, dark stone. He placed it in Mara's open palm. Images spilled from it, not of cities, but of blueprints. Layouts of the caverns, ventilation shafts, a subterranean garden where children chased light. There were access points marked in a script that was both mechanical and compassionate. He had not only shown them the problem, he had offered a doorway. Mara stared at the device, at the map that promised both sanctuary and exposure. She could feel the weight of choice like a thing pressed to her sternum. Outside, the desert wind carried a faint chorus of insects and far-off engines. The world was continuing without their permission. Daniel watched her as if measuring her heart against the map. The man who wore law like armor now saw herself, the woman who had loved and left and returned to dig up wounds. He stepped forward and placed a palm over hers, the touch an offer of alliance and of warning. "We do this together?" he asked, the words not quite a question. Mara looked from the device to his hand to Ilyr's luminous face. The fractures between them were not healed, they were raw and rearranged. But in the cavern of that small room, under humming fluorescence and the shelter of an abandoned outpost, she felt the possibility of a bridge. "Together," she said. The promise made a small sound, like a match scratching the air. Outside, something like a drone hummed over the rocks, a reminder that promises were perilous in a world where lights could locate you. Inside the room, under the hum and the map, the three of them stood at the edge of a fissure. The secrets had been revealed, the alliances bruised but forming. Fractures had been acknowledged and would need mending, and the cost of truth was already tallying itself. They were no longer three actors in a story of containment. They had become conspirators of care, caretakers of a secret that might either save or break many. The choice had been made to move forward, and with it came the knowledge that whatever path they walked would scar them in ways both fierce and tender. They moved with the weary speed of people who have already lost much, careful, exact, as if tenderness could be folded into breath and carried like contraband. The device Ilyr had given Mara burned faintly in her palm, a map that translated into heat the secret geography of the subterranean colony drawn in the language of instinct. Daniel loaded the plans into the outpost's antique laptop with hands that were both clumsy and reverent. He traced a route with his finger, noting guard shifts, camera blind spots, old service tunnels that had been mothballed but never sealed. He spoke in soft, professional tones, the cadence of an officer drafting contingency after contingency. Repeating the steps turned strategy into comfort. "We've got 1 hour before a sweep hits the southern sector," he said. "We land 3 small teams, follow the maintenance ladder 220 feet down, breach at Node 7, there's an airlock in the far wall of the cavern you saw. We move fast, we move clean." Mara felt the map like a promise and a threat. In her chest, the weight of her brother and the memory of the balloon case verdict merged with the images Ilyr had made flesh. Children asleep beneath glass domes, hybrid faces pressed against life as if against a window. The idea of walking away from that sleep made her feel like a traitor to everything tender she'd carried her whole life. She had come to Nevada to tend wounds, and now the stitches would be surgical or not at all. Ilyar hummed to himself, a vibration that passed through the plywood table into Mara's bones. He placed one filament on the screen, and the map rippled as if alive. Then, with a motion that was almost shy, he touched Mara's palm and pushed an image into her mind. A corridor with two small hands clasped around a taller, foreign one. The vision was at once an instruction and entreaty. They would be guardians for a night. They would be parents for a crisis. They left in pairs like a secret pilgrimage. Mara carried a small backpack, medical supplies, a stolen keycard, the silver band that still warmed the inside of her palm. And Ilyar tucked himself beneath a tarp in the back of the maintenance van, his filaments braided and steady. Daniel rode shotgun, a taut statue, jaw working as if chewing distance into obedience. They passed under agency roadblocks by turning down service tracks that existed because men had made plans for weather, for storms, for budgets that once lapsed. Now those tracks were lanes to a different kind of weather, the storm of truth. When they reached the maintenance shaft, the desert sky above was a bruise of approaching dawn. For a moment, Mara considered the way morning always dressed betrayal in soft light, made indictments pretty. She swallowed and opened the hatch, and air rose, cooler and older than the wind above, smelling like the inside of a tooth. The ladder descended into a dark throat, and they climbed with the concentrated silence of mourners. Each rung took them farther from the world that had agreed to forget. At Node 7, the door resisted once, and then yielded with the tired sound of bureaucracy unlatched for the first time in decades. The air on the other side carried a pulse, a living low hum, like breath that had learned the architecture of rock. They stood at the threshold and realized the world below had its own day and night, its own rules of whom to hide and whom to harbor. The cavern opened up beneath them like an overturned sky. Glass domes dotted the floor, each a small planet containing the slow, contained lives of those who had been kept and not explained. Children lay under translucent sheets with hair that glowed faintly when they breathed. They had human eyes threaded with other patterns. They turned in sleep with the lilt of something taught to copy both lullaby and data stream. For a second, Mara could not breathe. It was not the politics she had anticipated would unmake her. It was the sight of an actual child's thumb finding its mouth, the innocence that had no understanding of treaties. They moved like thieves of the sacred. Mara's voice was small as she opened a dome and touched a forehead that was warm and real and terrifying in its vulnerability. A small child stirred, lashes fluttering like soft flags. Ilyar provided a balm that was not medicinal but curative in the way he rearranged the air around them, the atmosphere shivering into a tonic that eased fevered sleepers. He cradled a child like a benediction, and Mara, fierce, terrifyingly practical, felt a fierce bloom of protectiveness rise inside her. The legal calculus evaporated in the face of a human being needing hands. They gathered the children with a speed that felt practiced. Names were invented lightly: Ella, Tomas, Nia, little anchors that tethered the small ones to human sound. Daniel carried the heaviest, a boy whose breathing caught like a snagged cord. He looked at Mara with something that almost broke his face, an apology and a declaration in a single glance. They had rehearsed evacuation routes and emergency signals, but nothing prepared them for how love rearranged priorities in 5 heartbeats: feed, soothe, wrap, move. The alarm that announced their presence was not the shriek of a siren, but a thin, cold beep from a reawakened sensor. Someone had finally noticed the deviation on the southern grid. Mara felt the room tilt, Earth and ethics caught in a single spin. They were running on borrowed time. "Split," Daniel said. "Ilyar, with me. You can help them move faster. Mara, take the east access. Signal when you're clear." She wanted to argue, to stay, and be the one to carry the last small body to safety. But she saw the calculation in Daniel's face. He was offering himself to the bull, a man willing to be the attractor of consequence. The sight of it made her angry and thankful in the same breath. Daniel had always been someone who would hold a line. Tonight, he was holding the line for the children and for her. They moved like a chain unspooling. Ilyar's filaments braided around tiny hands, and his light pooled like a lantern as they threaded through glass corridors and silent maintenance tunnels. Mara's pack snagged and tore. She left behind a trail that she hoped would lead no one back. Boots sounded from above, patrols reconfiguring into an arranged manhunt, and the cavern's acoustics turned every small noise into proclamation. When they reached the east access, Mara opened the hatch and felt the desert air slap her face like truth. She waved the children up, one by one, letting them see the sky as if it were a new religion. They blinked against starlight, and then, after a breath, laughed at the sand that got into their hair. The laughter made her heart a sluice, letting everything out. Behind them, weapons sang. The agency's response closed with the mechanical kindness of a closing trap. Daniel's voice came through the comms, terse, close, public. "Move, now." Mara ran with the last child, a small girl whose hair shimmered with the ghost of starlight, pressed tight to her chest. Ilyar only let go when the desert demanded that he free one hand to climb. Above, sentries shouted. Below, the cavern exhaled like something betrayed. Mara heard a new sound that made her blood go cold. A single, loud crack, a human note that had nothing to do with machinery. It was the sound of a decision being made. She turned as she vaulted into the open and watched Daniel stand in the mouth of the access, arms raised as if to embrace them all in a last impossible shield. Men with tactical gear moved like newly coordinated insects. Ilyar's filaments reached for Daniel, pooled light around him as if to make him invisible. Daniel met Ilyar's gaze, and for a breath the two of them spoke in the currency of those who love and keep faith, a promise wrapped in resolve. "You get them out," Daniel said. His voice broke on the last syllable. "I'll tell a story they can't ignore. The rest of his sentence drowned under the thunder of boots. "You can't take that alone," Mara said, wanting to hurl herself back into the trap, but the child's weight and the thrumming danger kept her feet pointed forward. "This is how I atone," he said. It was not a surrender, it was a choice, anchored in a kind of fierce love. "I promise to keep secrets. Tonight I break that promise in the only way I know how, by making myself answerable." He turned and moved toward the incoming line like a man making a last awful pilgrimage. Agents surrounded him. There was no theatrics, only the grim formality of handcuffs and papers being read. Daniel looked at Mara once, his expression a map of things he could not tell her without losing the language of duty. He stepped into cuffs like a priest stepping into a ritual he had always known. Mara wanted to scream at the world, at herself, at the paradox that the man who loved her was making a sacrifice that would tattoo them both with consequence. Ilyar touched her wrist, the filaments warm and quick. He sent an image that braided the moment into something they both could carry. Daniel standing at a table, hands open in a courtroom, telling the truth until the bones of policy splintered. The price would be his career, perhaps his freedom, the outcome uncertain. But in that vision, the truth lifted like a tide, and children in cages rose with it. Mara could not choose between law and love. She could only choose what sat on her hands in the present, the small, living bodies leaning into her chest. She ran, and the others ran, and behind them the desert flared with searchlights and the sharp geometry of men who had been taught to treat mystery as a hazard. Ilyar matched their pace with a preternatural calm, his filaments drawing a corridor of cool air that seemed to slow the world around them, giving tiny victories of time. They made their way to the cached service vehicle and then to the outpost. Engines coughed and then took. Sand whipped in a painterly blur. Mara held the children and watched the radio crackle. There was one clear message that pierced static, courtesy of Daniel's final professional maneuver, a broadcast he had triggered before his arrest, a leak into sympathetic channels, a signal addressed to those who could not be stone-hearted about a child's face. The transmission began with evidence, images Ilyar had given them, blueprints, medical records, and moved into something more dangerous, testimony. It was Daniel's voice, worn but lucid, telling a story of bargains and betrayals and the moral price of silence. He named names where he could. He spoke of treaties that had cost lives. The signal was small, barely a single ripple, but it was an honest ripple. Mara felt it like the vibration of a bell in her own sternum. To release truth was to invite consequence, but to smother it was to consent to other people's suffering. As they crossed the desert toward anonymity, a convoy of rural trucks forming a ragged shield behind them, Mara sat in the cab and let a child fall asleep on her shoulder. Ilyar leaned his head against the glass and pressed a filament to his temple as if listening to a far star. They had saved some. They had failed to save the neatness of law. And the cost had been Daniel's liberty, perhaps his safety. When they finally stopped under a moon that had the tired look of an honest witness, Mara let herself collapse into an exhausted, messy gratitude. The children slept with the fragile trust of those who had been given a second story. Ilyar sat with them, humming a quiet lullaby that was not any language she knew, and yet made her chest unclench. Mara thought of Daniel in cuffs, of the indictment waiting like a patient animal, and of the strange, wide thing that had grown between them, love braided with accountability. It had demanded a sacrifice he knew how to make. She wanted to hate the machinery that would punish him, to tear down the structures that prized control over care. Instead, she fed the children and wrapped them in blankets, and in the small domestic halo of that makeshift refuge, tried to summon a plan that would be both rescue and restitution. Ilyar took Mara's hand and pressed a filament into her palm. The device they'd carried pulsed faintly, and in its light a new image rose. A corridor with open doors, people stepping through into a world demanding to be more humane. The image was not a promise of safety. It was a possible future, messy and fragile and not yet written. "You gave me a word," Mara whispered into the dim, the children breathing like small machines of hope. "You gave me truth." Ilyar's light answered with something that felt like a name turned into a touch. He had revealed the secret because he had judged that mercy mattered more than the order his people had once preferred. He had chosen exile for the sake of nurture. Dawn found them on the road, a convoy and a rumor, children tucked into a net of strangers and friends who had chosen to believe them. News feeds began to itch with fragments, videos, a crooked press release, a leak of documents that were small and fierce. Daniel's sacrifice hummed under it all like a subcurrent, shaping the waves. Mara watched the horizon and felt the world tilting toward a reckoning that would hurt, and that hurt would be the honest kind. She thought of her brother's empty chair at the funeral, and of the promise she'd made to no one. The choice to tell or to hide had been made for her by a man in cuffs and by an exile who gave up a station to be human to these small ones. Love had been the currency of their rebellion, and it had demanded a price. As the convoy rolled into a town that would take witnesses and food, and perhaps, if they were lucky, compassion, Mara held Ilyar's hand and let herself imagine a future that was not neat but terribly alive. Daniel had earned a reckoning. She would be present for it. For now, the children slept, and the road ahead thrummed with rumor. The world would decide how to punish and how to heal, and the answer would be long. Under the wide, indifferent sky, Mara felt the shape of her life reforming around new truths. That secrecy could be broken, that love could be sacrificial and strategic, and that sometimes the bravest choice was the one that saved another person's small sleeping hand. She had helped an exile escape a hunger, and in doing so had unlatched a cavern of consequence. The work ahead would be costly, but in the hush of the van, with a child's breath on her collarbone and Ilyar's light in her palm, she allowed herself a rare thing, a quiet hope that was more rebellion than surrender. Dawn smeared silver across the road, while children slept like small planets against Mara's chest softly. Ilyar hummed low, filaments warm, his light a steady pulse that kept panic at bay tonight. News feeds fed rumors, activists gathered fragments. A smear of truth became an insistence that spread fast. Daniel sat in a cell that smelled like paper, his silence both punishment and prayer today. Mara visited once, bringing coffee that tasted of burned sugar and fragile courage to keep him. He looked at her with a softness honed by loss. His gratitude was legal and human. They argued in small hours about tactics, ethics, and the terrible arithmetic of exposure and compassion. Ilyar stayed nearby, teaching a child to hum stars into a ragged toy, patient and proud. Volunteers arrived, some stumbling, some fierce, bearing blankets, legal know-how, and weary love that would become their armor. The children unlearned fear in small increments, laughter in the morning, impatient questions by noon sometimes. Mara wrote lists, names, needs, tentative foster matches, each checkmark a small salvation and plans stitched from urgency. At night, Mara and Daniel negotiated testimonies through bars, their old tenderness threaded with consequence patiently. He promised to face whatever came. She promised to fight for him from outside the cells. Months passed, hearings unfurled like slow storms. Allies gathered, embarrassed officials whispered, some resigned and hopeful. The public's appetite surprised them. Children's faces are shards that pierce even hardened rhetoric and change. Ilyar received a small delegation across a digital channel, an awkward embassy of apology and curiosity emerging. He sent maps and protocols. He taught human caregivers to listen for the rhythms of alien. Legal teams drafted protections labeled with cautious bureaucratic language and radical tenderness that promised care, oversight. The children learned names for their dreams. Mara learned how to be less alone in grief. Sometimes Mara caught Daniel on a bench scribbling plans, his hands steady, his eyes finally softer. When the trials began, evidence flooded in, a legal river that carried small bodies toward safety. Allies who had been invisible surfaced, scientists, advocates, parents, bearing testimony that reshaped policy slowly and with care. Months blurred into careful reforms, transparency panels, guardianship programs, and monitored resettlement plans with community oversight. Daniel's sentence allowed parole. His testimony became a compass in fragile corridors of power and healing. Years later, Mara walked a park. A hybrid child chased light while she held Ilyar's hand.